Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to ZJLF at the British Library Knowledge Centre Theatre. We are delighted to introduce this session, Gramophone Women. Please ensure that your phones are on silent and there's no flash photography in the venue. Please welcome Vidya Shah and Rachel Dwyer.
This is a great opportunity for me because I've known Vidya for many years. And this morning, one of the pleasures was when I got up was to get out this beautiful book of hers, Jalsa. I think it's on sale here and really recommend it. It's easily available here because it's also published by Columbia University Press, as well as being available in India. And not only is it one of those books which has amazing research on archives showing the images and so on, but it also has the text. So really the only thing it doesn't have is the sound, and that's what we're going to get today, because I'm sure, as you all know, Vidya is also a singer, so we'll be having performance as part of the morning's activities as well. Now, I'm completely out of my depth with the topic. I know very little about it, but it's nice to be here in the British Library because I used to be Curator of Language and Dialect here in the Sound Archives. So in the Sound Archives, we had these incredible collections, and one of the things that might have been nice would have been to actually get some of them out today if we had longer to play them here. And I suppose the reason why I also I'm so interested in this, of course, is because there's so much which overlaps with the cinema. The Indian cinema, of course, you've got this same mixture of technology and tradition that come together to create something which is hybrid and unique in this, because it raises issues to do with culture and so on. I mean, it's around the same time as cinema, of course, 1902 being the sort of starting date here for the recorded sound. And I was wondering if I could just ask you for the people in the audience, perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about who made the recordings, how they did it, and how they decided what they were going to record.
Rachel, I just wanted to actually respond to something that you said about the British Library and the archives that you were associated with. So some years ago, the British Council had actually given me a Charles Wallace Award to come and look up the recordings here at the South Asian Archives. So for me, it's really special to be bringing this work back to this space where some of my research was actually done. And at that point also, the one thing that has come back to me repeatedly in this process of putting this book together, and also a performance that I do on the subject, is the richness of the music that's available from that time. It is estimated from collectors and from libraries and from archives that there were close to 500,000 records that were created in the first half of the 20th century, and there's barely a quarter that we can access. So that's really one of the reasons why I felt compelled to look into this time. And in terms of how it all began, it actually started out completely as a commercial effort. When the British, the Gramophone and Typewriter Company Limited came to India in the very late 19th century, early 20th century, the recording engineer who was sent was given the prime task of setting up a music market. And when he came to India, William Gaisberg, his name, he was completely confused, totally lost, intensely disliked what he heard, hated the music, and in fact, in some of his memoirs, he is outrightly, condescending about some of the women that he sees performing, but is challenged with this job that he's been given. And so he starts scouting for talent, looking for the known names, a lot of whom were from the Tawaif, the courtesan tradition, who were capable singers as well as dancers. And that's how he gets to listen to the first diva of this phenomenon, Gauhar Jan. And it was in the year 1902 that they go into a makeshift studio and create the first commercial recording of Indian music ever. And that was really the beginning of what caught on very quickly and changed the listening experience forever, I think, in terms of the different kinds of music that Indian music really is.
But I mean, not only changing the audience, but also the idea of, having to sing in. I mean, I presume it was a 3-minute slot at that point as well. I mean, and to sing to order really must have been something new.
That's absolutely right, because a lot of these women were trained in classical music, and they had, very important ustads who they learned from. So intrinsically, Indian music, especially classical music, is improvisatory in nature, and I think at the center of it is the idea of leisure. To be able to expand, make it your own. I mean, the languorousness of it has its own charm, and it's so central to the performance idiom as it were then. And to be able to collapse that into a 3-minute format was definitely a challenge. And at the point when it started, we must remember that there were no microphones. There was the wax on, where the women had to pretty much dig their faces into it, and therefore had to sing in higher pitches so that the voice could get embedded on the inside of the wax on. And initially, in the first 3-4 years, there was no publishing of record in India. I mean, it happened very soon in Kolkata, but before that, it would then be taken to places like Hanover in Germany, where a lot of these records were initially published. So it must have been clearly a very, very, not only a challenging time, but clearly something that held a lot of promise in terms of its commercial value. To have bothered with the effort of finding women, to get them to sing like this. And a lot of women had problems because they were only used to singing in mehfils, where the wah-wah was very important, and that kind of adulation that you get out of an interaction with the audience was completely missing in this seemingly inanimate process. So it took a while for them to get a hang of it, but that's also one of the reasons why it's important to celebrate the women in this time. This book actually comes out of a project called Women on Record, which is a performance. And it's the idea of the women on record, as in the women who sang on the gramophone record. But in the course of my journey, I also realized that there's very little record of them. So who were these women? We barely have names in discographies. We don't know anything about where they came from, how they ended up learning the music that they did, where they went. So it's only a handful of them who became divas of that time. Just going back to the question that you asked, so they had to specially train to raise their voices, the pitch, and to then cleverly decide how much they want to deliver on the 3-minute format. And it was not just the khayal or the kind of classical music that is practiced in India today, but there was a lot of other music that was being recorded, which is the other interesting aspect of this time, just to say that the idea of popular or saleable or commercial music, some of those ideas were very much the same then as they are now. So what sold then also had these sort of key elements of, what is entertaining and what is risque and what has English words. And so there were many such sort of ideas that the market had cleverly sort of addressed, the engineers had cleverly addressed to reach out to the market. So for instance, in the South, it was completely devotional when it started. And in the North, it was more the tawaif kind of music. So not only was it the 3-minute classical thing, but the one artist who really, really made a mark with the classical format was a woman called Zohrabai Agrewali. Zohrabai learned from her Sarangi Ustad, which was very common at that time, because a lot of the other Ustads who were sort of from these gharanas were not particularly comfortable to teach their, the tawaif students, the baijis as they were called. So it was quite common for women to learn from the Sarangiyas. She is really the one who mastered the classical format on the record. And she recorded 200 songs. All of them were reissued. And all this before the age of 35 when she died.
Well, I mean, it's an incredibly complex process, isn't it? You've got these white men coming talking to wives, making recordings, and presumably at that stage, gramophones are only affordable to a certain section of society who probably weren't the people that went to hear to wife. So you've got some sort of very odd kind of class restructuring going on around this, haven't you?
Definitely. Like I said, the men who really were sent to do this job were very clueless, and so they just decided to look for names which were doing well, and the other problem was they didn't understand the music, you know. So at one point when the gramophone tour started between 1908 and 1915, they actually had talent managers. So they were the facilitators. So they would then talk to the women for these men and see what could therefore be done. So it took a while to set this process in place. And if I can quickly read you something that the recording engineer said about these women, it's quite funny, I think.
And the pictures of these women are quite fascinating. I mean, I definitely wouldn't pick a fight with many of them. They look quite intimidating, and in their sort of rather aggressive poses before the camera, you can see in here.
So very quickly, just this one line from William Gersberg, who I said was the first recording engineer. In 1901, when he's looking for talent, he says, we made our first native records. Two little Notch girls, Shashimukhi and Fanibala, aged 14 and 16, with miserable voices. I had no idea what was going on. But they persisted in covering their faces and never got over the embarrassment we inspired in them. So it was clearly a funny time also in many ways. But like I said, you know, very soon a lot of interesting music. For instance, there were songs like Darling, tum ban gaye gentleman. So songs like that, and also really, it was not just the khayal and the tarana and the tappa, which is all classical stuff.
So not only is the gramophone creating these publics and moving the music around, but also the gramophone's impacting on the actual genres themselves, really, you know, even when they're not being recorded.
See, what it did do was it democratized the listening experience as much as it did the performance experience. So the machine itself became a curious social aspect of the lives of people. And of course, initially it was the Nawabs or the landed zamindars who had the machines and would sort of have these soirees. They even had gramophone soirees where they would invite people to sit and listen to a record. But there was also a time when they would have street corner soirees with the gramophone. So there would be a gramophone on a bullock cart, for instance, and people would stand around it and listen to records and feel very empowered that they don't have to be, a rich zamindar in the village to be able to enjoy this kind of music. So it created a new social paradigm. It was a real shift in how this highly exalted music, which was only meant for certain kinds of patrons in certain kinds of situations, performance situations, suddenly that changed. And that created a new set of audience, but it also opened up the idea of new kinds of women performers. You know, the anonymity that the machine offered created a confusion. But again, I want to reiterate that it's important to say that women were at the forefront of this, because the men initially actually declined recording opportunities. Several of the ustads were, they didn't want to record for two reasons. I mean, there's a lot of jokes that do the rounds about this, but I think two important reasons perhaps. One, because all of this was the Guru Shishya Parampara, the oral tradition where the Guru teaches the son or the son-in-law, or, in the entire sort of the male lineage around it. And therefore, it would have been beneath them to sell this music. And secondly, they were just outrightly unsure of technology and didn't know what it meant to, dig their head into that wax horn, and were very worried that the voice will go with the technology. So.
And we also, one of the things that's fascinating in here is you're, looking at the stars themselves. And everything seems to start with Gohar Jan, who has a very prosaic English name. I was very disappointed. I remember when I found that out, that she was really Eileen Angelina Yeoward. before she converted to Islam.
She was an Armenian Jew, and her mother, Malka Jan, was, of course, she became Malka Jan, but her father, Gohar's father, had left them when she was very young. And at that point, Malka Jan decided that she enjoys music, this music that she had seen in Mehfils. And because she's really left in the lurch, she has nothing, and this husband of her has dumped her and gone away somewhere, so she converts to Islam and learns music and learns dance. And herself is a competent performer. You have records of Malka Jan, who's Gohar's mother, and subsequently decides that Gohar also needs to learn, singing and dancing. And Gohar Jan actually learned Kathak from the grandfather of the Kathak legend, Birju Maharaj. So she was a very, very competent performer, therefore, very skilled. In addition to being a very charismatic sort of diva, who commanded probably the kind of respect that a lot of us are still trying to find our way with. So Gohar would, in fact, there's an episode in the book as well where the recording engineer says, "My God, we were always alarmed by this new gown that she would arrive every time she came in to record in the studio." And she had a horse cart, and she would pay extra tax because a lot of the Indians were not allowed to, own carts like that. So there are stories and stories where she once turned down Gandhiji because he didn't arrive to listen to her. She said, "I'm not going to give Congress the money I had, the Indian National Congress the money I had promised because, I promised because you said you'll come. You didn't come, so I don't need to keep my promise either." So that's also Gohar for you, yeah?
But it's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, these women are definitely, and with early cinema, even these women wouldn't act in cinema, famously. No woman would appear, and this idea of you could be then in this way not respectable and yet be this huge celebrity, and I think that's a sort of a dilemma that's remained in the Indian performing arts until real efforts to sort of make it more bourgeois.
I think there was a very accepted dichotomy, almost a hypocrisy actually, to say that, they were okay to be celebrated as entertainers. But a lot of these women, therefore, wanted to give up singing and dancing and marry and settle down. Because that's the only way they could have gained, social acceptance. So there are those sad stories. But the fact is that, the entertainment, even today, you would know that much more than me. There are women who do the item song, right? And of course, we all have a certain kind of a considered opinion on the item song, but we enjoy it. So this is really no different from that. The risque, some of the lewd stuff, the kind of things that were being recorded. So I think it's always been part of this entertainment versus mainstream society kind of a dichotomy, which has probably existed then as well. And I think the Tawaif community really epitomized that in many ways, isn't it?
And would you
Did I
say...
answer your question?
Yes. And would you say in some way that recording perhaps brought an end to the Tawaif culture?
It did some good things and some not so good things. You see, this was an interesting time in India because early 20th century, the nationalist movement, various discourses within the nationalist movement. So there was a lot of things going on there politically and socially as well. And this seemed like a great opportunity for the so-called purists to find a way to marginalize this community. And I say that very categorically because several of them who were good performers did suffer because, slowly other people started recording, men were recording, suddenly they started recording bhajans. There were, little speeches that were being recorded. Until then, the men were largely recording jokes. They were doing riddles, things like that on the record. But suddenly, with all this churning that was happening, you see a shift in how other people were coming into the recording phenomenon. And therefore, there was a conscious, slow effort to push them to the margin. And several of them suffered. And when you read their stories, you realize they died in penury. There was nobody by their side. Gohar died alone. She was being patronized by the Vodayars in Mysore. And at the age of 57, when she died, she was sick. There was nobody by her side. So I think these are revealing stories of how a very important aspect of the social history of Indian music is really missing from the mainstream discourse. So.
And there were other figures, though, who adapted more to cinema. I mean, obviously, Jadon Bai would be one of those fascinating characters. Could you say some more about her?
So Jadon Bai was Nargis's mother, and she, well, there are stories about how she was Jadon Bai and who Nargis was, and I was actually requested and categorically told by the family to refrain from getting into too much detail, which I think is only fair because Nargis and Jadon have contributed so much to the cultural fabric of both film and music. Jadon was discovered by Sehgal and R.C. Boral, who were very important figures in the 30s and 40s. Sehgal Saab, K.L. Sehgal, I'm sure those of you who are interested in music, was a very, very important singer and actor. So he discovered Jadon and decided to give her a break. And there was no looking back from there. She did really well. She set up a production house, which produced movies. She even directed music for some of her films. But what she also decided was that she will not encourage Nargis to do music or dance. She decided that there is no future in this world, and so Nargis should actually get into films. So that was Jadon, and she also supported the nationalist movement in a very big way. She supported the progressive writers. She created little booklets of nationalist songs. So there was all of that also to her. And yeah, so she was really a woman with a vision.
But perhaps it was also, this difference between being heard and being seen. That, even the Tarifs didn't want to be seen on screen, perhaps at the time. And you're thinking of women in the film industry like Saraswati Devi, who were never, I don't think I don't think I ever saw Saraswati Devi, but how women from Parsi families even could come into this world.
Saraswati Devi is credited to be the first music director in Indian cinema. And she came from a Parsi family, and I think her original name was Khurshid. And her family actually set up something called the Parsi Gayan Uttejak Mandali in Pune, which basically means encouraging music. So when she came to the industry, the general idea was that a Parsi name will not work. So that's how she became Saraswati Devi. And so she directs music for some very important films in the 30s. Main Ban Ki Chidiya Ban Ban Dolo Re, the Devika Rani classic Achut Kanya is one film that she's famous for. But she also did something in 1934 for a film called Jawani Ki Hawa, where she introduces the idea of playback. I'm going to sing you a song that she sang. So this is from a 1934 classic. It's called Jawani Ki Hawa, and Saraswati Devi sings this herself for the protagonist, who happens to be her sister. कित गए हो खेवन हार, कित गए हो खेवन हार, नैया डूबती नैया डूबती, कित गए हो खेवन हार, जो मैं ऐसा जानती प्रीत किए दुख होय, नगर ढिंढोरा पीटती, हाँ प्रीत न करियो कोई, मोहे छोड़ गए मझधार, मोहे छोड़ गए मझधार, नैया डूबती. So this was her, but also even before film happened, Rachel, there were some who became popular through through for her sister. I'll have to try and remember her name right now. I will. No, that was Achut Kanya in 38. Yeah, yeah. Main ban ki chidiya ban ban dolo re was. Although that was not playback, Devika Rani sang herself. Yeah. There were some women who became popular also because of advertisements. You know how this whole thing was being pushed, the market. So some became, like for instance, you have Gohar Jan, you had Zohra Bai, but there was also another category of women with the title Miss. So some of them would appear in English newspapers. You know, so one, I don't know if you've heard of Dulari. Dulari was one such performer who became quite well known, I think. And so there's an ad in the newspaper for her which says, lucky he who hastens to taste the honey of life. Lucky he who hastens to taste the honey of life. Unlucky he who sits at home with his wife. Come and listen to Miss Dulari. So there were all kinds of. In fact, I'd like to. Can I just play a video? It's just some images of advertisements, which. This one, yeah. So if you see that, you know, as we move along, you'll see the different kinds of advertisements, also different languages, Indian languages, the kind of music that they were pushing. Calcutta, of course, as we all know, was a very, very important center where it all began. Gramophone dance program. So you had the music playing on the machine while they were... Yes, of course. And while all this was happening, there was a whole sort of a social language around this that was being created as well. So people would have jokes, riddles, stories, silly songs, all of which included the idea of the gramophone or singing or cinema. That's Gohar Jan in the picture there. That's
you can recognize it by the eyebrow anyway.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, and you can see the imagery. It says Cairo, and you can see how they're, you know. This is the gramophone Devi, the idea of Devi. And it's interesting because the script is Urdu, as you can see, and the image there is of a Devi. This is again the whole South thing where devotional music was... So, you know, they would sing songs like, this is something that I just picked up. There's nothing classical about it. But there were fun songs also that... पहने कुर्ता पर पतलून आधा फागुन आधा जून पहने कुर्ता पर पतलून आधा फागुन आधा जून बाबा पूर्वी धुन में गाए बेटा फिल्मी गीत सुनाए बाबा पूर्वी धुन में गाए बेटा फिल्मी गीत सुनाए घर माँ बाजे ग्रामोफोन आधा फागुन आधा जून घर माँ बाजे ग्रामोफोन आधा फागुन आधा जून बाबा सूखी रोटी खाए बेटा अंडा दूध उड़ाए बाबा सूखी रोटी खाए बेटा अंडा दूध उड़ाए अम्मा खाए आलू भून घर माँ बाजे ग्रामोफोन अम्मा खाए आलू भून घर में बाजे gramophone. So there were
And I thought telephone and Rangoon were the best rhymes in songs.
So, but there was also other music which was not, I mean, this is all Hindi, so I can't sort of really adequately translate it with enough, let's say, zest. Because the amorous element was not just in the Tumri and all that we celebrate as semi-classical. There was a lot of, what would be sold as popular geet. There was also that. So there were some very famous singers who at that point just sang, because it was exciting to be on the gramophone and become famous and a performer and, lots of people get to know you. I mean, this was not the time when you had social media and Facebook and whatever. So it must have been a challenge to become popular. Having said that, they sang these songs, and then when they became famous, they were very reluctant to let people know that they had also done this, right? So, in fact, there's another song. Rachel, you have to sort of deal with the fact that I sing more than I can, write. So, there's another song which is quite funny, which was sung by a very, very famous artist of her time. पतली कमर लंबे बाल अरे हाँ लंबे बाल चलूं जैसे कामनिया. So basically slim waist, long hair, and I walk like a model on a ramp. That's what it is. So she recorded it, and then she became really famous in a few years after that. And so then she requested that the record be withdrawn. And that, it should not be sold, it should not be reissued, certainly, because it just didn't seem to fit the image that she had. And this was none other than Begum Akhtar who had sung this. So, so there are many sort of, and Gohar Jan sang in 20 languages. It's a fantastic time. There was a woman called Angur Bala who sang a very, very, she came out of, there were 3 women in Bengal who became very popular in the 40s, 50s. Angur Bala, Indu Bala, and Kamla Jharia. Kamla Jharia was also known for singing ghazal, but she also sang Nazrul Geeti and these other genres as well. So Indu Bala, for instance, sang a song that became very popular in a film later, which was picked up by film. There's so many such songs, and you would perhaps know how they've been taken from the 30s, pre-film era, pre-talkies era, and a lot of them have done very well in cinema. So this song that Indu Bala sang, and Indu Bala, I just want to quickly say there's just so many stories, but anyway, Indu Bala, just to quickly say that she was born to a trapeze artist in a circus. So the mother was very keen that she joins the circus, but she decides that her heart lies in singing, and so she leaves home at the age of 13. I think it's phenomenal that they knew what they wanted to do, and they were so smitten by the idea of becoming popular in this entertainment sort of. So some things still remain, So she sang this one. घट पे नंदलाल. So she sings it like in a classical version, like a thumri, and the words are a little different. So there's a little more gait in the मोहे पन घट पे नंदलाल घेर लियो रे मोरी नाजुक कन्हैया मरोर लियो रे मोहे पन घट. So she actually renders it with great poise, which is very different from the film version, which is also beautiful. So
The song in Gujarati play.
Mohe pan ghat pe? I see, okay. I see.
Play, which was done in Mumbai, Bhagwadi.
Ah, I see, okay.
And the author of that poem sued Shakal Badar.
Very good for him.
I didn't know that.
So there's slight.
Ah.
Raghunath Brahmbhatt was the man who wrote poems for...
See, that's going to be part of the next edition of this book. That's how we collect our stories. Thank you for sharing. But also the idea of Mohe Panghat pe Nandalal Gher, you know, they tweak it a little bit when it comes into the film. But there is a certain traditional approach which has also been so Indubala.
And I'm sure everybody knows which film we're talking about.
Of course, the iconic Mughal-e-Azam, yes. Yeah. Oh.
But that interaction as well, I mean, I don't want to sort of head too far forwards, but I've heard people talking about when the Mangeshkars come into the film industry and the recording industry in this high pitch, which, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the pitch being partly for the recording, but other people have said, you know, it's the thing about Lata is she was always meant to be more the kind of the voice of the home, while Asha remained the voice of the outside. And this idea of, you know, making the singing respectable in a way by raising the pitch. But that's always seemed to me to be somewhat undermined by the fact Noor Jahan also sang in a very similar high-pitched style. I mean...
You see, the thing that you may want to look at is that there was room for different kinds of voices. So you had Suraya at one end, who was also a very fairly shrill, high-pitched voice. I mean, softer, but fairly high-pitched. But then you also had Shamshad Begum, you had other women who did not have... They had a nasal tone, sure, but it was not necessarily very high-pitched. But there is this whole obsession about what a female voice, what a feminine voice should be like, right? So when Lata Mangeshkar and when she came into the film industry in the 40s, that was the perfect fit that I think the sort of the gendered lot were looking for. That this kind of sweet mellifluousness is what feminine is all about. And so that became a template, you know. And in the process, a lot of these women, therefore, lost out on work. So many songs that have been... I mean, there are stories and stories about that. You know, that's another chapter in itself. But Lataji, for instance, some of the songs that she sang have been rendered by other singers earlier, but they were picked up by her voice eventually because this idea of sweetness, feminineness, all that, she sort of set a trend. And then because she became popular, then it became another political story. So.
But I mean, when you hear these voices, I mean, that really, I mean, it always seems that the male voice is one that travels internationally easily. And interesting that the engineer here mentions that he didn't like the women's voices. But this huge change in the women's voices, and now interestingly in film we're also getting other voices coming back of these sort of lower pitches and different style of projection.
I think the entertainment industry is, it can be very fickle in the sense that, you know, if something is working, then why bother with anything else? It's pretty much that kind of logic. And Lataji had become a phenomenon very soon after she came into the picture, and she came with an impeccable training as well. It's not, I mean, she was a phenomenal singer, she is. So if it worked, and if that's the voice quality that's working, then it takes a long time for the entertainment industry, where there's so much money, to actually bother with taking risk. And with a male voice, you know, the idea of the heroine has a certain image, right? So if this voice suits that image, then I think there was really no reason for them to look outside of this format. I think that's partly how one can just, I don't think there's too much else to, apart from the fact that, she put her foot down and she said, so-and-so should not sing, I will not work with this director. There are those stories, but those are personal stories, really.
But you're flattening playback singing in a way. I mean, great. I mean,
You're actually standardizing, you're homogenizing it through decades. Yeah. But it worked. I mean, you listen to those songs, they're beautiful.
No, I mean, perfect voice. But
so clearly it worked, you know. And it's, at the end of the day, it's about making money. So.
Yeah.
It's a classical training as well she had.
No, that's what I said. She's a phenomenal singer. I mean, my due respect. She's an ustad, no doubt. Fantastic singing. But he also said that of Zohrabai Agrewali, which we don't remember. He also said that of Zohrabai Agrewali. Both he and Ustad Fayaz Khan said कि इनका गाना सुन के ही हमारी ठुमरी में रस आया है. So you see, we don't know that, but...
But also, if you didn't have recording, you would, because, I've been with Lataji when she's singing, And I mean, you know, if I was sitting where you are, I wouldn't be able to hear her. I mean, her voice is so quiet.
Right, yes.
And yet,
It's actually made for the mic.
Yeah.
Which is also true of some of the male voices. It's just one little bit that I wanted to share there. That in the beginning, when I said men were not recording, there were a couple of men who were recording. And one of the ustads of one of the schools of Indian music, Kirana Gharana, was Ustad Abdul Karim Khan Sahab. And there's a phenomenal recording of his from 1905. And in that recording, you see that his voice is made for the mic. Some voices just lend themselves better to the microphone. So there was him, and then there were two other men who recorded. One was Pyara Sahib, and the other one was Maujuddin Khan. The reason why I mention names is because I think that's a very important aspect of this project, to sort of keep mentioning names so that people know that people existed. Pyara Sahib became popular, and in one of Gersberg's memoirs, he says he was popular because his voice sounded like a woman's. You know, so that again, that same high-pitched sort of meh, that tone. So yeah, there is something about the quality of the voice that defines, you know, the image that one has in mind, I think.
And do you have a favourite singer from this period? To ask a very light question.
It's very light, really. I do like several, actually, of these women. And again, when I listen to the music, I feel so overwhelmed by the fact it's the same repertoire that we learn in the Guru Shishya Parampara. And to be able to listen to them like this is... But I am I'm a great fan of Begum Akhtar's. I had the privilege of learning from her students. So not just of her music, but of her as a person. Because I think the struggles and the sheer humor that she saw in her struggles and how she dealt with it says a lot about how much she loved her music. And how she was really one with her music. And I think that really excites me about her life. So I sing a lot of her repertoire.
And I'm going to put the microphone down to encourage you to do it right now.
So when she was 18 years old, her mother was a little worried that she was becoming very interested in cinema. The idea of getting into cinema. Not 18, she was 21. And so she acted in a couple of films which did reasonably well. Roti was a film that was directed by Mehboob Khan with Anil Biswas, who did the music, the songs were a hit in that movie. So the mother is concerned that the daughter is being lost to the big bad world of films. And so she takes her to a Peer Baba and tells the Baba that do something about my daughter. I seem to be losing her to this world of films. So the Peer Baba says, he asks her to pull out what is called the bayas, or it's essentially the notebook where you carry all your lyrics, the songs and the ghazals and so on. So she pulls out her bayas and he just opens it and he puts his finger on this particular poem and says, sing this in your next recording. And that recording was such a huge hit that much before she became Begum Akhtar, she was Akhtari Bai Faizabad. But that was really the ghazal that defined her music as a ghazal singer for, I think, for centuries to come, really. So I'm going to sing that one right now. And wondered how these women managed to perform, speak, and sing. Beyonce, Jennifer, how did they do it? दीवाना बनाना है तो दीवाना बना दे दीवाना बनाना है तो दीवाना बना दे ये दीवाना बनाना है तो दीवाना बना दे वरना कहीं तकदीर तमाशान बना दे ये दीवाना बनाना बना दे मैं ढूंढ रहा हूँ मेरी वो शम्मा कहाँ है मेरी वो शम्मा कहाँ है जो बज़्म की हर चीज को परवाना बना दे ये जो बज़्म की हर चीज को परवाना बना दे दीवाना बनाना है तो दीवाना बना दे ए देखने वालों मुझे हंस हंस के न देखो तुमको भी मोहब्बत कहीं मुझ सा न बना दे ये दीवाना बनाना है तो दीवाना बना दे Very hard to translate Urdu ghazal.
They always sound absolutely ridiculous when translated. I think, and there's that one project, you remember the one that Ejaz Ahmed did, where he got different poets to translate ghazals, and I think that was one of the few times you
that
could
it was done
actually...
with some, yeah. There's of course people like Agha Shahid Ali and who have done it very well, but I would dare not venture in that direction. So.
And I mean, Begum Akhtar is one of the, I mean, the names that we would have heard of more perhaps among the ghazal singers, and there's been books written about her. I mean, Salim and people have written about her. But trying to think of, are there singers that you feel that have really been forgotten that should be...
Oh, yes. I mean, there are just so many names in the discography, and you listen to some of these voices, and if you're really curious, then of course, dear Google will give you as much information as you want. But you will also realize that with the name, there's usually a place attached to the name. So it would be Kiti Jan of Meerut, Umda Jan of Muzaffarnagar, or Mehboob Jan of Sholapur, to also suggest where they came from. And the reason why that's important information is that a lot of this music also collected around places of trade, wherever business was happening, where people collected to do this kind of work. So typically women like this were called in the evening to entertain. So that's another, but it's been very hard to find out too much about their lives, because there's really very little access to who they were, and some of them are just phenomenal singers.
I mean, there always seems to be also in film, you have this sort of the culture of the bazaar, meeting with these sort of Western educated elites, in Calcutta New Theatres. I mean, you mentioned Sehgal and people who work there, and I think that's one of the problems as well, isn't it? That people almost now want to celebrate the kind of more middle class type of cinema that was emerging, and ideas of nationalism, rather than these women who were from very dubious backgrounds. I mean, most of the women in cinema in it, I mean, the notable exceptions were from these dubious backgrounds, and it'd be nice to see something like plaques to these women in the towns that they took their names from.
It's a lovely idea, really.
Zorabai Ambaliwali in Mahal. I mean, beautiful.
Rajkumari, so many names, so many names. That's a lovely idea, actually. But although, I mean, what you just said could hold true for today. The kind of entertainment that people are really sort of defining as it should be and what they enjoy. And the idea of, there's this whole notion of classical being something overly traditional, which is too intense, which is too hard to bother with. You need entertainment just to let your hair down. So there are all, I think some of those things have remained. And continue to exist even today. I mean, look at the kind of cinema that one is seeing. There's fabulous cinema. I'm not being sort of judgmental or cynical, but I'm just saying that certain kinds of cinema is accepted by a much larger audience. And similarly with music, I mean, the kind of music that a lot of these women did was niche.
And, I mean, film's been very interested in these women. I mean, whether it's Shyam Benegal, Bhumika, or Mandi, or Siddheshwari Devi. I mean, these filmmakers perhaps more in the art house cinema, and because in the mainstream, of course, it's Rajan and, you know, these sort of very different kinds of
I have to say this really, I mean,
depictions.
I've seen Siddheshwari by Manikal a few times, and it's a very intense film. And it looks at Siddheshwari's life at many levels, including her own sort of, her suffering as a woman as well. So there are so many aspects to that, you know, it's a very abstract film also. And when I met Siddheshwari ji's mother, she said, is this really about my mother? You know, it was so abstract.
Also, yeah.
Speaking of art house cinema, and so it's very hard to. So she said, "Is this really about Ma? I'm not sure." So that it's not easy to. I mean, you know, you had Zubaida, or you had. I mean, I think Bhumika was a beautiful film, but still only seen as a certain kind of cinema. So it lends itself to so much visual, yeah.
But I suppose it's also, I mean, it's not just a question of their dubious, not dubious to us, but publicly dubious backgrounds. And also the idea that these were women who were trained, educated, talented, making their own money, you know, I mean, able to outrage. You know, they could go out in the street, drive around in their horse carts, they could throw great parties. I mean, they were really, you know, disruptive, disorderly women.
In a nice way.
Yeah, I mean, no, in a great way.
in a kind of an envious way for a lot of women, yes.
But, you know, the idea they weren't just pretty women. I mean, you know...
No, they were actually not all pretty. You were right about some of the faces. They're quite intimidating and unpleasant, in fact. I mean, this whole idea, Tawaif means this beautiful belle is not true. But it could have generated a lot of... envy, jealousy. Sundarabai Punekar was this woman who sang beautifully in the 50s and 60s and wrote absolutely rubbish lyric to the ghazals that she sang. It was really bad, this writing, but became very popular, you know. So there's this one ghazal where she's busy describing a kiss with her lover, which is really, you know, it's not even pedestal stuff, it's really bad. But became very popular. And she made so much money. It is said that she owned actually a building in Bombay's prime location, VT, near VT somewhere. So to own actually, but then she obviously had many enemies, and finally when she died, she had nothing. So, they met their sad end as well.
And I mean, many did in the film industry as well. I mean, really, you know, this idea of what to do with these people.
But it's also the point that you raised about being heard versus being seen, which the respectability for which has clearly changed over the years. And so around the 40s or the 50s, when this happened, when, you know, independence happened and so on, a lot of them actually lost their voice for this very reason, you know. So you know, institutionally, for instance, the All India Radio, in one of the committees in the 50s, they categorically mentioned that women who are married can record. You know, therefore clearly saying that these women cannot record. So a lot of them then became Devis, Begums. You know, they just rechristen themselves, which is also part of their sense of enterprise struggle and, you know, the willingness to take on. So there has been a very deliberate attempt, and that's what Women on Record is really trying to do, to sort of put it back on track and say that they were an important source of, you know, the records are also a very important documentation source, which, because in an oral tradition, it goes away otherwise. And depending on, you know, what trajectories traditions take, we may lose everything. We may not, but... So the records are also an important source that one can lean back to, refer to, bandishes, compositions. But having said that, there has been a discrimination there as well. So an ustad would teach half a bandish, half a composition to a woman and say, okay, figure out the rest. So there are some records where they have manufactured their own lyric to the rest of the bandish. So that becomes oral tradition then.
Well, I suppose sitting in the British Library then, my last question would be, where are the archives now? Where are these materials being archived, preserved? I mean, we know how difficult it is to get access to the HMV archive, to the All India Radio archive. Where are these things being archived and made accessible nowadays?
it's true that the institutional archives are very hard to get to, actually. The All India Radio Archive, I've been trying for the last 7 years, and they never say no, but, but you can't listen to anything there. Some of them were just, erased. They've actually re-recorded on tapes. They've been eaten up by rats. There are all kinds of horrendous stories. Anyway, that's another story. But a lot of the collections that we were able to access were from private collectors. And also some private archives, like, you have the Saptak Foundation in Ahmedabad. So you have people like that who have created listening rooms. So at least there is some access to what one wants to do. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to ask for a few questions. I'm afraid we agreed earlier that I was certainly more interested in hearing Vidya perform, which would take more time than a normal talk. But we would like maybe to throw the floor open to a couple of questions, please, with the microphone.
I just want to ask you, you've hardly said anything about the South Indian aspect of it. And I've been trying to research on this for quite some time. And other than M.S. Subbalakshmi, a certain amount of Vinay Dhanammal, and one clip of Bangalore Nagaratnamal, there is nothing. And there were a lot of Devdasis at that time who were singing and who must have recorded.
No, you're absolutely right. But I have to admit that my book is focused on Northern India.
Okay.
And I've already started my research on the Southern Indian phenomenon as well. And maybe I'll write you a mail and ask you for suggestions. There were a lot of women. Nagaratnamma, Mudduparni, all these people were definitely there.
Mudduparni, I
came
think,
before Nagaratnamma, yes. But also it's a very different market that came up in the South. And like you rightly pointed, it was linked to the whole Devdasi contribution to the record, yes.
I just mentioned there's been an award-winning book by Devesh Sonaji on the South Indian and the Devdasis. And I know he's in London this week, next week, so I don't know if he's giving any talks, but at the University of Pennsylvania might be a good person to contact.
Excuse me, will you repeat it again?
Devesh Sonaji has written
Devesh Soni has written a book on the Southern...
on the Devdasis.
There's also another very good book on Nagaratnamma, which you may want to access, by V. Sriram. Nagaratnamma, if I can just add quickly, was this fantastic Devadasi who became very popular, etc. But she completely rips apart the Brahminical hypocrisy around Carnatic music. So she sets up, there was one of the most venerated composers of southern India is Saint Tyagaraja. Tyagaraja came from a little town called Tiruvayar in Tamil Nadu. And, people thought he was really the ultimate devotee of Lord Rama and so on and so forth. But when he passed away, there was no money to set up anything in memory of Tyagaraja. And Nagaratnamma, this Devadasi, discovers that there's nothing to celebrate Tyagaraja. And because she's a Devadasi, she can't do it directly. So she sets up a trust where she invites all these ustads of the Carnatic world. And that's how they now have a little thing in Tiruvayar. So yeah, that's also the Devadasi story, there's so much out there, really.
Make that.
You tell a story that Abdul Karim Khan recorded Piyagi Ninahi Avadiche, which was very popular. And Saigal sang that in Devdas, in this thing when he's lying in the gutter. And Abdul Karim Khan was called to the shooting. And he was very offended. All he said is, Ladka acha gata hai.
I think we've run out of time for questions, but there will be an opportunity to chat to them both, I'm sure, after the session. Please join me in thanking Vidya Shah and Rachel Dwyer. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the last session of the ZJLF at the British Library Knowledge Centre Theatre. We are delighted to introduce hyphenations of poets, cultures and continents. Also, please ensure that your phones are on silent and there's no flash photography in the venue. Please welcome Daljit Nagara, Guillermo Rodriguez in conversation with Arundhati Subramaniam. Thank you.
Hello, does this work? Yes? Okay. Welcome to this session. It's, as you know, it's hyphenations, and we're going to be talking about poetry and hyphenation, but we do hope to be able to smuggle in poems as well. There's no point having poets on stage if you don't have poems. But I just want to very briefly introduce my two panelists to you. There's Daljit Nagra, who of course is well known to many of you here as an exciting British Punjabi poet, one of the most significant voices in English poetry in this country. And we have Guillermo Rodriguez, who is a Spanish scholar who's worked on the work of an exceptional Indian poet, translator, and scholar, a poet of the 20th century, A.K. Ramanujan. And while Daljit was born and brought up here, we have A.K. Ramanujan, who grew up in India, spent the first 3.5 decades of his life there, three odd decades of his life there, and then moved to the US, where he became eventually a very significant figure in the Department of South Asian Studies at the University of Chicago, and is very well known to all of us as a translator. In fact, for many Indians, he uncovered a very significant literary ancestry. So, two exciting voices, and at the end of it, I come in as well, as a poet who was born in India, and who, by a combination of choice and some inertia, continue to live there. So I'm going to talk about what hyphenation means to me. And we're going to begin this session with Daljit. Yeah, Daljit, whose work is known to many of you, of course, is someone whose work has excited me for many years, but it was just very recently that I read his Ramayana, which is the book that I'd like to start talking about, because I was just fascinated, Daljit, by the fact that, for one, that you undertook the Ramayana at all, which we'll come to. But I'm going to just start by asking you what the motivation was to do the Ramayana. Was it a need in some way to reclaim some cultural memory for oneself, as someone who grew up in this country, but an Indian who grew up in this country? Or was it a need to make spin out a really good yarn for a contemporary multicultural audience? What was it for you?
Yeah, so I've got the mic, haven't I? I don't need that. Yeah, a couple of reasons, I guess, in particular, picking up on the last point you made, was that, there's been, I don't know, for about 15 years now, children in primary schools in Britain who are aware of some aspects of the Ramayana story. Yeah. So most children around the country, and I've been to various schools in North of England, Cornwall and places, have heard of Rama, Sita, Ravana. But they don't know the full story or don't know much beyond that. So I felt it was a good time to write a version of the Ramayana that would give people an insight. And because I started seeing the Ramayana as being a part of British culture, I think it is part of the British culture now. We have Diwali, which is part of British culture, and the Ramayana is becoming that. So it felt the right time to do a version of that. And also, I think the other main reason for me was to sort of understand. I have a very fraught, tense relationship with my sort of parents, my background. I want to understand their value systems to some degree, and I thought I'd go back. I've been reading the Mahabharata, I've been reading the Ramayana, and I felt I really want to spend at least a couple of years just interrogating that to understand a kind of Indian value system or whatever that idea might be. So they were the two motivations, really.
The Indian value system. Would you like to say more? Because I know you've
not
talked
really,
about...
no, because it's such a general big thing.
I know, so which is why I was curious.
I guess I want to understand honour system and, family loyalty, the good and the bad of those things. And it came out on the back of the research, having obviously a much healthier respect for Indian culture, Indian knowledge. And I would say I probably didn't have a great knowledge of Indian traditions and systems. I probably had a better knowledge of the popular, like Bollywood films and sort of Punjabi rural knowledge, that kind of thing. So it was partly a kind of personal journey. That then transformed into a version. And I wasn't expecting to do one. I was going to write a poem for a collection, and then I just couldn't stop myself, and I started reading different versions, and then it went out of control.
Okay. Because what is interesting about that book, and for those of you who haven't read it, I think copies are available. It's an energetic, alive Ramayana, really. And what struck me about it is the fact that when one undertakes an epic, one often believes that the approach will be one of gravitas. But that's not the kind of book it is. It's racy and exuberant and funny.
Yeah, I guess the title here is a hyphenations there, and I think one of the things that appealed to me was that I didn't feel there was an authoritative text. Yes. And I started reading the versions in different parts of India, the Malaysian, Thai, Burmese versions, these different versions, the translations I get hold of, and suddenly it felt an exciting venture for me. And I'm really into texts that have an insecure heritage, in the sense that there are multiple versions, because I'm very into trying to create global kind of texts that speak from different heritages. And then I got into the sort of street performance, the puppet shows. So I tried to do kind of have that built into the text. So I was trying to basically do, action, reflection, as befits an epic, rather than as befits a saga, say. Yes. So I was trying to go after that. And so there are moments that are very lively, I think. Absolutely. And also, in a sense, it was my third book, and I've been very loud in my first book, even louder in the second. I want to see how much noise and how much kind of language from various traditions I could bring in. And the reminder felt right for that, for the ultimate eclectic fantasy that I had for myself.
Yeah. In fact, you have the gods gurgling with collywobbles, and you have Ravana described as a gunda and a scallywag. There are just some wonderful moments in that, and I hope you're going to read
that
from
bit?
it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll just read a little bit of my prologue. So I just made that up based on various versions and things. So in my version, the gods have gone to complain to Vishnu that Ravana is becoming powerful. So I'll read that bit. Normally I do a longer explanation, but I think I'm probably the least knowledgeable on this. So it's just called Get Ravana. Lord of the cosmos, Vishnu was brought back to heaven from a stellar meditation by many gods now stooped at his feet. Said one, semi-stooped in the saffron light, O Lord, whilst we in thousand-day prayers for peace are bent, Ravana is bish-boshing our kingdoms. No wonder the gods were gurgling with collywobbles. Ravana was toasting their earthly and galactic worlds. But who was this scallywag, this Gunda? Lord of the cosmos, Vishnu flashed umpteen visions to the gods that showed Ravana's path to glory. In the first flashback, Vishnu displayed Ravana being born with 10 heads and 10 pairs of arms. Then he showed Ravana, the teenager, on a hillock, meditating for so many non-stop years that smoke was issuing from his head and dulling the heavens. No surprise, in Vishnu's next vision, Ravana was losing his mind and was holding a blade to cut off his own 10 heads. Vishnu from on high stopped him by asking what he is wanting. Ravana boomed back, Am I not a worthy king of the universe, Lord? Vishnu must have hoped Ravana would become pure Shanti, a bit like himself. Yet soon as Vishnu's divine engine touched across each Ravana atom in a somewhat unparalleled way, Ravana went bonkers. His 10 heads, his 10 sets of arm, trapezoid, rump, knuckle and whatnot jutted tsunami volcanically into a hardcore fierce firming up. His every milli-inch was muscling, pinnacling with indestructibilityness. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Were you aware, Daljit, at the time that you were writing it, of the kind of challenge this must have, or did it seem like a challenge? I'm not just talking about the formal challenges of doing this, but also what it means to do an epic and the kind of response that it might receive from the Hindu traditionalists, which could be one of outrage, the kind of response it might receive from dogmatic rationalists, which would be one of contempt, and from others, which is plain indifference, because most people are not interested in thinking about epics, necessarily.
Yeah,
so,
Yeah. I mean, firstly, when you write poems, you expect nobody to read them anyway. So I felt very liberated. I do with each book I write. I feel very liberated. So I just made sure I didn't hit the religious versions. Yes. The aim was not to offend anybody, and to just dramatise and create complexity in the characters in a respectful way. So that is a massive challenge. That was very hard, constantly rewriting. And it's a sort of story that you could spend, you know, a lifetime or 2 lifetimes writing. And I gave myself 2.5 years, and the amount of research I could do and write was going to be the limit. So I bound myself in that, knowing that this is, and I write that in my introduction, and when I've done interviews, that this is a version based on a short time span. It's not an authoritative version because it's not based on a particular tradition. So it's very much a rag bag, a kind of a second-hand bookshop kind of version of different bits put together, a kind of Frankenstein's monster, that kind of thing. And I wanted it to be hybrid, I wanted it to be bastardized, but ultimately dramatized and really capturing characters in a kind of real, trying to get them real complexity. And I haven't read the versions. I don't think any of them, there's not a satirical tradition of it. I know over recent decades there's been, you know, feminist, Marxist versions of stories, but it was really important for me to keep off those because a Western audience doesn't know the story. So I want to make sure I kept to the main thread of the story, but then refer to different traditions, you know, whether it be Thai version or Burmese or Nepalese version, to bring in things to make my story cohere and make its own logical sense.
Yes. And because you talked about that complexity, I think that leads up to the question that in many ways the session is about more largely, which is, I think, what really is it like to be what you are, which is a Punjabi, Sikh, British poet? Have you ever wished for a less complicated identity?
Yeah, it's a tricky life growing up, but once I started writing poetry, I felt really liberated, actually. And you suddenly feel that's a point of strength, that you can bring in, you know, sit one word from one tradition alongside another word from a different tradition, or a word from Low English to High English, Archaic English, Punjabi, whatever. Suddenly the world feels really exciting and dynamic, because in language, the way you sit language together, it sits really peacefully and it's happy, and you suddenly see language itself as a vehicle of harmony, of having its own United Nations fantasy of peace, global peace, I think.
Well, I do know, I have read somewhere, tell me if I'm right about this, I have read somewhere that in your early years as a poet, you actually sent poems out with a pseudonym, and the pseudonym was Khan Singh Kumar. Am I right?
Yeah, you got a
Which is an
terribly
absolute
good memory. I'm not happy about that. Yeah.
Which is a
long
wonderful
time ago.
and absolutely improbable name, of course. But it's sort of, I could see an Amar Akbar Anthony fantasy at work there. And maybe an actual excitement about complicatedness.
Yeah, I love that.
Yes.
Yeah, and I mean, I wrote for fun. I didn't expect to get published or anything. And then suddenly I got poems published, and then you get paid for it. And the check would come through saying, you know, Khan Singh Kumar. So I have to write back, and it just became a bit complicated. And then I had to, you know, I worked with some poets who said that actually you need to use your own name and embrace your own identity. So when I did, I actually felt kind of quite wholesome. Until then, it was a perverse little thing, writing. You know, my dad was a wrestler, and my mum's, you know, not educated. For them, so to even know their son's writing poetry would have been abhorrent. So I never told them I wrote poetry. They just found out on radio. So I won this prize, forward prize for a poem, and it was on the Indian radio stations on the hour. My relatives have all got shops, corner shops, and they heard my name being, Daljit sang Daljit Nagra, blah, blah. So that was the first time that they'd heard that he does some weird stuff like writing, or, you know. But then it was sort of formalised then.
Okay, so what did they think you did?
Well, I mean, I had a day job as a teacher, but I mean, they knew I did some other dabbling and some weird stuff, things like that. And anyway, they weren't impressed. All they want to know is how much money you got for it. And I said,
absolutely,
£1,000. And they're like, what? That's it? And how long did it take you to write? And 3 years. The returns weren't good, you know. So.
I think one of the characteristics of your poetry has been this kind of linguistic khichdi that you come up with, really, right? It's celebratory, it's self-ironizing, it's a complex language. I'm curious about how that evolved. Was this the way you were writing at the start, or was this an attempt that you made at the very beginning? Or in the process of finding your voice as a poet, at some point you believed that this was the route that you should take?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I did start writing kind of third-person pieces of how Indians are really lovely people. you know, tourist board poetry. We're all lovely, and obviously it doesn't feel very authentic or real. And at some point, I just decided, I was really into Robert Browning. I liked those monologues. And I think that really liberated my voice to write in the first person. I wanted to write about those, you know, the way Indians, you know, my relatives sit next to each other and they're shouting. They're having a conversation by shouting. And you know, you can't translate that. So I thought I'd create an artificial English to really capture those sort of uneducated Sikh Punjabis who came to Britain, you know, from the late 1950s onwards. So that kind of gave me that freedom, and suddenly the poems really started flowing at that point.
Was this with your first book? Before
yeah,
that?
yeah, right at the start of the first book.
Yeah.
When that happened, I felt really free and excited. I felt I'd created my own little voice for myself to keep myself amused. I mean, you write because you're a child, really, because you want to play. You know, it's that being in the kindergarten, as you know. So that was really good playtime for me, and it still is.
Yes. No, I know with your new book, is it British Museum?
Yeah.
So it's interesting to be talking about that here in the British Library, where I believe much of it was not this particular book. You said you were actually researching a great deal of one of your books
Ramayana
here. It was the Ramayana,
yeah.
okay.
A couple of years, yeah.
Really?
There's so much stuff here.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I did 2 years research, and I could have carried on longer with the amount of stuff they've got to do with the Ramayana. Yeah.
But with British Museum, it's really, tell me more about the book, but as I understand it, it's about a generation of Indians that came to the UK and which you feel is really fast dying out, and it's a whole generation that hasn't been talked about enough. Was that how you?
Yeah, was that
your entry point?
That's very. I want to write a book about Britishness, where we are as British people now, and from my point of view, I want to write partly about that first generation. Those uneducated Indians who came to Britain and made a massive impact on the culture of Britain. I'm thinking of Indian restaurants and the corner shops. It's a huge impact. And they were largely the uneducated ones who came over. So for me, it's really important to celebrate their achievement. And they're slowly dying off now. So it's really important to create poetry about them. So part of the book is really a recognition of them. Largely the good work they've done. Yeah.
Yes.
So it's a happy thing.
It's a happy book.
Yeah, in that sense, yeah.
Yes. Would you like to read from it?
Yeah, I'm going to read an unhappy one, though.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
No, it's a unhappy. No, it's the unhappy one. I just want to write a poem about me, my mother. So I've got white wife, Gauri, that kind of, and my parents are not, they rather just call, I know they call her Gauri behind my back and that's it. So she's called Catherine, and we've been together for nearly 14 years. My parents still can't say her name. They say it's too difficult to say for us. And my mum did try and say her name once, about 3 years ago, and she said, Gain. And she never said it again. That sort of sparked off thinking about cane, sugar cane. My parents, they grow sugar in their villages in Punjab. So really, I was really started thinking about the empire kind of bitterness, as it were. So this is the poem about that, I guess. So it's called Cane. No English talk at home. My mother booms in Punjabi. Our carpets bloom florals from where she sobs at each Punjab film when lovers croon along sugarcane fields. I turn my head from her soppy Pollywood. She cries that my tongue is sold on a language that stole her life for the rootless exchange, like sugar that travelled one way, and offers to arrange me a wife and a corner shop. When I steal off to study for an English degree, at our shop back door, she stands between us to hold me firm and sob, nor speak white girls. She's been here so long that I can't follow how she won't ripen with time. Only when torn does she meet my sweetheart, who bears our roses. My mum blushes to say, very kind. Our tongues are reined in. I keep my own counsel and let the air go bitter when she won't sustain Catherine. Once when she called, instead of she said the name aloud. It was cut down to Cain. Okay, thank you.
Would you like to read another, Daljit?
Are you sure?
Yes,
Okay, all right.
yes.
All right, I'll read my opening. That's quite short as well, so I'll read a short one. Yeah, that's very good. So I guess I had a kind of arranged, forced kind of marriage a long time ago. So it's partly about that, but it's also, my wife and I've got 2 daughters. Haha, happy, happy time. So it's that time when the second daughter was about to go into bed from the cot, you know, that special moment. And so I wrote this, my wife was, I think it's the first time in a while she was going out, so I wrote this poem that night about our daughters. So it's called Father of Only Daughters. 1,000 times or more tonight, now you're in a big girl bed and it's mum's rare night out. I've simply flown upstairs to watch you upside down again. I'm so over my head, knowing you're safe at this stage behind your bed guard. 2 years old, already a clown, you're the jumping sidekick to your bigger sister, who's kicked off her duvet again. In my past, I was treated as a child when I was a man and forced to remain in wedlock to uphold the family name. Look at me flying upstairs on the wings of my shame for my second chance life, a life under yours in a fall. Thank you.
The wonderful thing about having poets on a panel is that we can smuggle in poems. To me, that's just the most wonderful thing about a festival like this, because there's really nothing as immediate and direct as the reading of poems. So I'm so glad we had time for that. Thank you, Daljit.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that seems like the right moment, Guillermo, to invite you as well to be part of this. Guillermo is the author of this tome, but a tome that's well worth reading. It's called When Mirrors Are Windows, and it's a book, as I said, on A.K. Ramanujan. It presents his published and unpublished work. And it presents, to me, what made this book so interesting is the fact that it presents A.K. Ramanujan not in terms of some simplistic categories. We are not given a portrait of A.K. Ramanujan as this homesick, alienated, rootless Indian who suddenly found his Indianness when he went to the West. Instead, it's a complex portrait where we are reminded again and again that this is a man culturally very sophisticated who's fully aware of the tensions, of the complexities, of the arguments and quarrels that are happening within each tradition. I think to me that was the most interesting thing about your book, really, Guillermo, that there are no easy binaries that it offers between East and West. And I'm just going to ask you to talk a little more about that, because you have this wonderful quote here where A.K. Ramanujan describes himself, very appropriately for this session, as the hyphen in Indo-American studies. Tell us more.
Thank you. Yes, it's certainly a book about complex identity, but it's a beautiful metaphor of perhaps what 20th century India, is or was about, through the eyes of a scholar and a poet. So it's a homage to, in a sense, to the man who, embodied a lot of interesting tensions, which I'll now describe, a lot of different hyphens in 20th century India. But it's also a homage to the poet, to the act of creating, of what inspiration is about, what poetry is about, and how crucial and important it is, and more so than ever today, where we have to look at, first of all, how we can break those compartments. And he talked about osmosis, permeable membranes rather than fixed compartments. And he talked about how, we have to look at the world through the eyes of a poet, because you have to think that everything is distorted, a distorted reality. And, the beauty of the title itself, When Mirrors Are Windows, will also explain us what he meant by that. So coming to the hyphens, I think he embodied several, tensions in hyphens. First of all, and this is to introduce also for those of you not familiar with Ramanujan, as you rightly said, his first 30 years were spent in India. So I would say the first hyphen you can draw, or the first line is, he was a Tamil Brahmin who grew up in Mysore, which is a Kannada-speaking area in the south of India. And he always used, one of the interesting notions is that whatever metaphors he used, he applied then later into his scholarship. He was a scholar and a poet. So one of the beautiful metaphors he applied was the house. The house is the home. The house is the place where you imbibe you know, your traditions, and where you get your first, you're nurtured as an artist and as a person. And he used to say and distinguish between the mother tongues and the father tongues. So down in the kitchen, he would listen to the tales, the oral traditions, the folklore, you know, the grandmother, aunts, you know, passing by, and women's stories, and this was nurturing his universe. Whereas, you know, in the attic, there was his father who was a mathematician, and the high science of Sanskrit and English poets and the romantic poets were to be found, and mathematics. After all, you know, he was named Ramanujan after the famous mathematician, because his father, a lot of people don't know that, but his father was a famous mathematician, lived around the same time as Srinivasa Ramanujan. So he thought, you know, as a homage to his friend, he named it Ramanujan. But, you know, Ramanujan failed as a 16-year-old boy. He failed a history exam. And this was quite a lucky you know, accident, because that drew him to writing and reading a lot of stuff. And among the things that he read were the vachanas of the Bhakti revolutionary, you know, Veerashaiva poets, who in the Middle Ages, you know, kind of created a new idea of anti-structure. So no caste, no, you know, Brahmanical constraints. This is the other hyphen. Interesting hyphen, because he brought in the subaltern. He, at the time when nobody had even termed or coined the term subaltern, he was interested in the orality of tales, in women's stories, in a different viewpoint. And that also meant for him kind of shunning Brahmanism. So he threw away his sacred thread, and this was another kind of tension, and he did not want to know anything about it. He didn't want to speak to his father, and he got more interested, and he was a Vaishnavite who embraced Veerashaiva poetry. So there was another rebellious act. The other hyphen, which is also quite interesting, by the way, he was collecting folk tales around India and noting everything down, and just because of the love for it, and he was teaching as a professor of English, because he didn't go into mathematics as his father wanted to, and went into literature, which is something that his father didn't understand. As you said, you know, why do you want to become a writer or a professor of English? Sounded more or less okay. I mean, we're talking 1940s, very crucial time. So another hyphen is the whole North and South India, the Dravidian nationalism and the Sanskrit kind of hegemony and orthodox way of looking at religion. So as I said, he was collecting tales, and he was doing all this, and suddenly one of these trips he bumped into an American anthropologist, and he asked him, "What are you doing?" "Well, I'm just collecting this material because I think it's fascinating." "Well, what you're doing is actually called anthropology. You know, it's a science." So he got very keen interest in knowing more about that, applied, you know, for a Fulbright scholarship to study, you know, linguistics, that was closer to his own discipline. And 1959, he boarded a ship and went to America, Indiana University, to do a PhD in linguistics. And in a way, through linguistics, he was able to combine both his interest in science and in poetry. So the next hyphen is India and America. You know, he called himself the hyphen in Indo-American studies. And he was somewhere in that tension. But then the next hyphen is perhaps one of the most important items in this whole Ramanujan story, is that he was a bridge between, you know, he's considered a modernist poet, but his aesthetics is quite romantic. So he bridged the romantic, modernist, and the postmodern, you know, at a time when a lot of people were thinking, you know, you should write like you know, Carlos Williams and T.S. Eliot. He slowly also imbibed the postmodern, and there was a challenge in him. So this brings us to the final last hyphen, and this is the text. He was a translator. He had to translate because he had to translate all these hyphens in tension within himself, and it has brought us some of the most amazing, you know, texts from the South Indian tradition into English. And if I would say what is his most important contribution, as Anantamurthy said, you know, he wrote an essay when Ramanujan passed away at the age of 63, at the peak of his career. He said, what is it, you know, the importance of being Ramanujan. He brought an entire new, unknown tradition of the time when in America, everything was Sanskrit Indology and looking at the orthodox text. He brought in a new area of, South Indian studies. And this is a huge contribution. And he engaged a lot of poets to do the same thing and translate texts. And this is something that he wanted to do. And this brought us and brings us also to his obsession with the past. The hyphen of connecting the present and the past. But how did he express? He expressed it through poetry.
Yes. Yes. In fact, this morning we did a session on Bhakti poetry. I don't know how many of you were here for that. But one of the things I did do was to read more than one of Ramanujan's translations there. Yeah. I think, not just for America, he's been significant for many of us Indians in uncovering traditions that we ourselves were just dimly aware of, bringing it to English translation. Pre-Aryan Tamil Sangam poetry, really, to actually read it in the English, in those magnificent translations, I think has really changed the way many of us look at our own heritage.
Because the key, the mystery was, as he called poetry an ordinary mystery, and the act of translation. He said, you have to let poetry win without allowing scholarship to lose. And another interesting phrase was, poems or translations are never finished, only abundant. It's not a closed act. You can't find a closed act and the way of expressing. See, all of this if you would look at the world, as a tree, and this Upanishadic idea of the tree cosmos and the tree upside down tree, what the consciousness is, because all of these elements that I've just mentioned, were part of the self, are part of your identity. They're not just loose strands, but he called it, before, everybody talks about the net now and network. He talked about literatures as networks and reflections and refractions. Yes. How texts reflect one another. That's why the idea of mirror and glass is so important in his poetry. Everything is mirror image.
I just wondered, in fact, if you want to read that particular
I will read
poem.
That.
Yes.
I will read that.
Yes.
So the whole idea of, the poem I'm going to read is about, he says, glass is good. It reflects to the outsider and refracts for the insider, So I will read or recite another poem of his, and that may lead us to other reflections. Yes. I resemble everyone but myself, and sometimes see in shop windows, despite the well-known laws of optics, the portrait of a stranger, date unknown, often signed in a corner by my father. So this person looking at the window, shop window, seeing himself, but who's on the other side, and somewhere there's his father, Father is always, we always have the past in us somewhere in the corner, date unknown. And I think, this is also why he wrote a whole essay called Where Mirrors Are Windows, yes, towards an anthology of reflections. So he's obsessed about mirrors and glass because it's a beautiful metaphor. And the other beautiful metaphor I would like to just share with you is, again, the tree. The tree, how everything is connected, and this Upanishadic idea of, he uses it in one of the poems, but it's a gypsy proverb that says, you can sometimes count all the oranges in a single tree, but never all the trees in a single orange.
Yes. I must say, for me, that particular image, and also the one of the home as a multi-tiered abode, where nothing, the fact that he doesn't set up an easy hierarchy at all. I think for us, many of us who write in English in India today, this has been a particularly important stand. This ability to see contradiction and yet not set up an easy hierarchy, because there's always the sky, the terrace that's open to the sky. So it's always open to bewilderment, in a sense. To me, that makes that image so strong.
And you see, as I was telling you, why did I get involved with Ramanujan? I mean,
in fact, that's a particularly interesting hyphen.
No, the idea is, for those of us who went to India, or anyone who get involved in India, whether you're a Spaniard, an Indian, or German, or Russian, or whatever, you know, India is a very complex world, and it's somehow, I always say when you go to India, it just places a mirror in front of you, you know. Whether this mirror becomes a window, it reflects both your beauty and your ugliness, and it brings it out, and it brings out also the mystery of what the identity is about, and all these reflections may become something. So I personally was drawn to poetry, and I discovered through Ramanujan, you know, reading his poems, they have so many layers. I was struck by his poetry because they were like you know, a house of mirrors, and had so many different layers. And then only later I found out, oh, he's also an essayist, and he wrote a lot of, by the way, this is famous essay about the 300 Ramayanas, which I'm sure you've read.
Which I'm sure we're going to have questions about.
So I discovered that all these layers were in him. He's a very complex poet, but you can just enjoy the poems as objects or as beautifully crafted works of art. So for me, it was poetry. For my wife, who did the same journey with me, it was done. She discovered it's done. So what Ramanujan gives you, or any piece of art that you encounter, it can be anything, will at some point, or has to become a window to this complex universe of India. And after all, it's about an identity search of your own identity, so which is also full of hyphenations. But maybe we should let Ramanujan explain what he thought about.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I would love to read. Well, first, there's this other beautiful metaphor of the sitar. You know, why it came to my head, I was just attending, I ran away from British Library, escaped or eloped to listen to, you know, Ravi Shankar homage. There was a memorial, and playing the sitar, he thought he was connected to the cosmos and the universe, which is, you know, where inspiration came from. For the whole question was, where does inspiration come from? You know, where does it come from? For Ramanujan, he liked the metaphor of this sitar because he said that you pluck a string, and he wanted his poetry to reverberate, you know, to resound, resonate, like in a sitar you have the simple, you know, the resonating strings with all the other sounds around him, which is all those other branches around him. And this was a beautiful metaphor which he also used. But let me now use his own voice. As you said, you know, I think it was a treasure house. I bumped into his diaries at the archives in Chicago, you know, about 17 years ago, and that's why I started writing about Ramanujan, because I just thought that, you know, he was somebody who, I'm sure he left something behind. So I found all his diaries, you know, in the archives there, and I'm happy to share some of these where he explains what poetry means. This is very short, so I know we're short of time. So I'm going to mix it with some of the poems, and we actually have.
I think we have. How much time do we have?
Okay, I'll be very. This is my last, and please. Yeah, let us listen to Ramanujan. Okay. This is 1976, 30th October. I never thought of myself as a writer. I just write. I'm startled when someone introduces me in print or in conversation as a poet. One is a poet only in the poem. Poets are specialists in what everyone does all the time. It isn't true that once a poet, always a poet, and everywhere a poet. Poems, when they come, surprise me. I feel a poem has chosen me, not me the poem. And this is not being mystical. I have the same feeling about thoughts, ideas, events, persons. Maybe a certain passivity, a need to say, I didn't work for it. I'm not responsible. For years, I took the Buddhist slogan, take nothing that's not given, literally, except I reversed it to take everything that's given or say no to nothing, which landed me in dreadful dilemmas with food and women. So in a way, he says, one needs the other, even if it's the mocking other, to find oneself, and the English language, America, has been that other. As a translator, one translates to repossess one's past, not only to realize the pastness of the past, but the presence of the past. And it's in America, the other, that I learned to do it, though I had begun much earlier. In this business of translating and translating from one tradition to the other, funny things happen. jazz poem for Soma, an unpublished poem after experimenting with mescaline and drugs. Soma, why Soma? Soma is not Vishnu. Soma, no mimic similar, has no similitude, grows ordinary as mystery. Ancient familiar, the always here. Soma is the same as you and you and you when you make the right mistake and find your best attitude. So, poets, beware. And here he links with the medieval hymns of the drowning poem. Poets, beware, your life is in danger. The Lord of Gardens is a thief, a cheat, master of illusions. He came to me, a wizard with words, sneaked into my body, my breath, with bystanders looking on, but seeing nothing. He consumed me, live and limp, and filled me, made me over into himself.
In fact, that particular close is from Nammalvar, whom I read this morning. And I think Hymns for the Drowning is one of A.K. Ramanujan's most significant works of translation. Every time I go back to that, I'm quite amazed by it. Yet another book I'd recommend. I know we have...
Why don't we drown in your poetry now?
I don't think there's enough time to drown.
Please.
I really don't.
Yes. Yes.
Yes, but I do know that we're running short of time, so I'm trying to think of the best way to approach this. I wanted to talk a little about where I was at, but I think since we're running short of time, I'm just going to read a poem. How does that sound? Yes? Let me just read a poem from an earlier book, not from the most recent one, When God is a Traveler. I thought I'd read from the recent book, but the reason I'm choosing to read this particular poem, which is a rage poem, so it's an energy poem to end with. I would have liked to read something mellower as well, but that's not going to be possible. So this is a rage poem addressed to a Welsh critic. But I should just say that it could just as well be addressed to many of the voices back home in India that also tell you that there is just one way to belong. There are many voices like that all over the world. So in a way, I see this as just a poem about resisting ready-made language. And I think that's the business of poets, really, to constantly resist ready-made language in one way or the other. It's one long rant of a poem, and I'll be done. To the Welsh critic who doesn't find me identifiably Indian. You believe you know me, wide-eyed Inglit type, from a sun-scalded colony, reading my Keats, or is it yours? While my country detonates on your television screen. You imagine you've cracked my deepest fantasy. Oh, to be in an Edwardian vicarage, living out my dharma with every sip of dandelion tea and dreams of the weekend jumble sale. You may have a point. I know nothing about silly mid-offs. I stammer through my Tamil, and I long for a nirvana that is hermetic, odor-free, bottled in Switzerland, money back guaranteed. This business about language, how much of it is mine, how much yours? How much from the mind, how much from the gut? How much is too little, how much too much? How much from the salon, how much from the slum? How I say verisimilitude, how I say brahadaranyaka, how I say varaparam, it's all yours to measure. The pathology of my breath, the halitosis of gender, my homogenized plosives about as rustic as a mouth-freshened global village. Arbiter of identity, remake me as you will. Write me a new alphabet of danger, a new patois to match the chola bronze of my skin. Teach me how to come of age in a literature you've bark-scratched into scripture, smear my consonants with cow dung and turmeric and godhuli. Pity me, sweating, rancid, on the other side of the counter. Stamp my papers, lease me a new anxiety, grant me a visa to the country of my birth. Teach me how to belong, the way you do on every page of world history. Thank you.
Wonderful. Great. Questions?
I think if there are questions, we should move straight into questions. Are there questions? Are there just comments, anything you'd like to share? Feel free, we have a few minutes for that. Yeah? Okay. And yes.
I think we all need to drink water now.
Thank you so much for a fantastic session. I was particularly taken with your poem at the end there, and also with the connections really with the kind of language you use to actually engage with poetry. And I'm interested in, when you're writing, to what extent you find that the kind of critical language that obviously you use to engage with poetry informs or influences, or perhaps it doesn't, your own writing. Thank you.
That's such a good question, really, and that's a hyphen right there, isn't there? Yes. I think in this particular poem, I allowed myself a certain kind of critical language just to suggest a certain awareness about this. And sometimes I realized this is not the kind of poem I would customarily write, but sometimes it feels like in order to resist a gatekeeper, a cultural gatekeeper, you have to turn into a gatekeeper yourself, very briefly. So this was my gatekeeper moment, just to say, this is how I'm going to be, and I'm fully aware of the choices I've made, and it's a conscious choice. So I think that was the reason why a certain critical terminology entered this. But there are other kinds of poems which would probably use language differently. But I think the excitement about different textures of language that Daljit talked about as well, the demotic in his case, as well as using street language, various kinds of hybridity. I think for me, exploring textures of language in one way or the other is vital. So if it's not between the critical and the creative, other kinds of textures, certainly. Sometimes bringing in, I have L'Oreal sunsets, for instance, coming into one poem, which is the only way I could describe a Bombay sunset. So that kind of thing is an important part of the making of a poem for me.
I like reading and writing poems.
Oh, that's lovely.
Well done.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful to know. And don't forget that you said this today, many years later.
Yes.
Huh? Continue. Thank you.
I don't think I can follow that. Not with this question, anyway. But one thing that's interested me is it's a time difference, in a sense, between Ramanujan and Daljit's work and your work. And I just wanted to think about, it's reminding me about the previous session or before William and Anita and on migrant words. The idea of not having any hyphens, and what Mulk Rajaland, who was a bit earlier than the poet you're talking about, always talked about literature as a sea of stories, and your title is Hyphenations, Poets, Cultures and is really what you're doing is really is in a sense drawing on that sea of stories across all these different languages, whether they're direct translations or living in translations or hybridity in terms of contemporary life. And I just wondered if some of these earlier writers, in a sense, were speaking the same kind of language as we're speaking in this sort of post, migrant, whatever we call it, world, where the migrants become an everyman. Yeah.
Yes. Would you like to take that?
I would like to say, I don't need that. Yeah, I forgot that. I think what's interesting about time and, that kind of time travel we do when we translate. And I think I should probably ask you also as poets. In the Ramanujan's case, he was very influenced by though he doesn't mention it directly, by the idea that T.S. Eliot, tradition and the individual talent, which brings us to the idea of whether what we create now, even as critics, even as poets, as writers, is also changing the past. Or to what extent can Keats influence Shakespeare, or Shakespeare can influence, Ovid, or, Homer. How does that work? What is the dialogue between the text of what is produced now and the future and the past? Or is that a fluidity? And this is something that Ramanujan believed in, that everything is fluid. He wanted to insert or inscribe his own work in that tradition, because he thought that's how it was in the past. We think in linear times. I think historiography in the West, and what history is about, is very linear, like progressive. But even the whole concept of parampara, tradition, in the Indian context, is a completely different thing. It's not tradere. Tradition comes from Latin, means to bring this way. Parampara is what is far behind. So, to what extent are we traveling behind, or are we moving forward? That whole idea has to be kind of readdressed, especially through art and poetry.
Mm-hmm. I think what interests me about Ramanujan particularly is the way in which he articulates himself time and again as a poet and as an essayist without ever falling into either extreme. He never sounds like one of those foaming chauvinists, he never turns parochial, nor does he ever he never sounds like a glib world citizen. It's a complex identity in both cases. To me, that makes Ramanujan in many ways an interesting sort of proposition, that it's not easy.
So may I ask you, in your poem you just read, I had this notion that I heard Ramanujan's resonating voice there of the mock poem Prayers to Lord Murugan. Is some of that in there? Maybe unconsciously, or maybe in your case, to what extent are other voices or other stories just floating around, and you're just opening up, a Pandora box, and how?
Absolutely. Well, I think any writer has to accept that you are part of a tradition. You're taking on board that tradition, and you haven't flown in from a different planet. So the writers I like, I like them because I can hear loads of other writers in them. Yeah. If I can't hear loads of writers from hundreds of years, they're probably not a good writer, I think, because part of writing is your kind of homage to your reading as it comes out in your writing. So yes, I think we are directly or indirectly influenced by Ramanujan, say.
And you have become part of the Ramayana tradition now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yes, you are.
Yeah, completely. I agree. Yeah, yeah, you are. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I'm sorry, I don't even think we answered your question, did we? We didn't. We went into something else. I'm so sorry. And the notion...
It's fluid. It's fluid. It's not... It's a fluid concept. Yeah.
Yes.
After all, what's a hyphen is a line, but you can...
But the hyphen as rupture and the hyphen as bridge, to see it much more as bridge than rupture, I think, is what all these three poets in different ways, I think, are doing. Yes.
Yeah.
When do you use a hyphen in a text? When you're not sure of the spelling sometimes? In the English language, you use a lot of hyphens. And we don't use that many hyphens. It's either, one word or two words.
Or for compound language, creating a new word.
Yes. Yeah, so it's this whole tension about synthetic and analytical also, synthetic or analytical. Yes.
It's a question to Daljit. You got young children. I was wondering what you saw of the future of hyphenation, if we can use that term for your own children, because I'm not quite sure what third or fourth generation, what it's going to mean to them, and is that angry, loud, uneducated Punjabiness going to continue? In which ways you might seek to continue it in your own poetic life?
Well, I feel really positive about, so I'm thinking my two daughters, my wife Catherine's, third generation, that there's an incredible enrichment that's taking place. We live sort of in West London, Harrow. They're in a community with Gujaratis, East Europeans, Irish and White English. So there's an incredible vibrancy, I think. In terms of Indianness, they've got certain things that they regard as Indian they want to take on board, as well as other things. So I really celebrate that kind of hybrid mix they have. I think it's a different type of person that's coming through.
Do we have time for it? Yes.
So far I've heard hyphenations being also compared to sort of as a tension. You mentioned it being a rupture, possibly a bridge. But is there a kind of resistance in that when you write your poetry? I mean, in my everyday life, being hyphenated and being made aware that I'm hyphenated. I don't walk around consciously, but being made aware by micro interactions. I feel that it's a constant resistance for me to stay there and not be pulled to either one of the two polarities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, may I just respond to that personally?
Yeah.
I just want to say that, even living in a country like India, this is what I was intended to say at the start, is in a sense like living in a situation of perpetual hyphenation on so many levels. But one of the kinds of hyphenation that I've become particularly aware of in more recent times is that between the sacred and the secular, which I think is a conceptual fragmentation that has happened. It's not the way we live our lives. In India, in some way or the other, the spiritual is leaking into your life, one way or the other. But in our heads, there is such a divide. And so it often feels, for instance, for me, it felt when I was growing up, that it was a marker of liberalism, for instance, to talk about sex. But it was no longer a marker of liberalism to talk about the spiritual. That had become the heresy of our times, in a way. So it was, in a sense, coming out of the closet, for me personally, to be able to say, I want the right to be both. I want the right to be not hermetically sacred and not barrenly secular. I don't want to have to choose between submission and suspicion. I want the right to be both, which is, I think, what many of us effortlessly are, but we are often encouraged to believe by people who are rigid on either side of the divide that we have to choose. So you're absolutely right. I think it's a day-to-day, sometimes moment-to-moment negotiation. Yeah. I have a feeling we may be running out of time, but we're always happy to continue this more informally. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. Thank you. Thank you, Guillermo. Thank you, Belgium.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much to all of our speakers. They will be signing copies of their books just outside the theatre now following this session. And at 7:30 there will be evening music in the entrance hall. Thank you all very much for coming.